On the morning of the 18th of July 1944, around the French town of Caen, the thunderous roar of bombers, artillery and 600 tank engines shattered the silence to signal the start of what will go down in history as Normandy's largest single tank battle. In this video, using the latest technology, unique archive footage and the testimony of those who were there, we'll follow in the tank tracks of one unit and one group of men as they spearheaded the advance in its opening hours. This is the story of Operation Goodwood. For us to understand Operation Goodwood, we need to step back 6 weeks to D-Day. As we know, the Allies successfully landed on the Normandy beaches in these 5 key locations, but since then, progress inland had been painfully slow due to fierce German resistance. Allied leaders expected that once the beachheads had been successfully established, the Germans would withdraw for several reasons. Not only did the retreat mean that they would be out of range of the vast Allied naval firepower, they could also set up defences on terrain that was much better suited to defensive fighting. But they were wrong. The Germans instead dug in, turning the Normandy campaign into a gruelling battle of attrition. If we look at an aerial map of the eastern part of Normandy, we can turn our focus to the heart of the struggle, Caen. Heavily defended and strategically vital with its railways, main roads and waterways, it had been the scene of heavy fighting for weeks. Capturing Caen was crucial for securing inland routes and exploiting the open, tank-friendly terrain south and east of the city. It was in this area that the next major Allied offensive would be aimed. By mid-July, after several failed breakout attempts to the west of the city, Allied commanders, including Generals Bradley, Dempsey and Montgomery, had tabled and agreed the outline for Operation Goodwood. Broadly, it would involve 3 British armour divisions assaulting to the east of the city with the intention of breaking through German defences in this area, capturing the strategically vital Bourguiba Ridge and, if possible, opening the route to the crossroads town of Folie. If all went to plan, coordinated with the US-led Operation Cobra to the west, German forces in Normandy would simply be overwhelmed and risk encirclement and annihilation. Whilst relatively simple on paper, the reality of breaking through German defences south of the Orne River was a far more difficult prospect. Let's take a look at what they were facing. In short, the German defences in this area were broken down into 4 belts or zones of defence. The first was comprised of the expendable infantry of the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, in place around Tuffreville and Demuville, to provide early warning, slow enemy advances and break up formations, though in reality only temporarily. The second line, located roughly here, was anchored on these villages, with Cagny, seen as it looked at the time of the battle, being a particularly strong centre of resistance. Each contained a battery of 6 anti-tank guns and numerous infantrymen. They too were to hold up enemy advances and specifically target exposed armour trying to penetrate through the open ground between the villages. The defences in this area were organised by Major Alfred Becker, an industrialist and engineer who had a knack for creating makeshift self-propelled guns using captured chassis and weapons. Beyond these positions we find the third and strongest defensive zone, running along the steady rise known as the Bourguiba Ridge, and anchored on the villages of Bourguiba, Hubert, Folie and Bras, with strong infantry formations, around 80 artillery pieces, 2.5 brigades of Nabalwerfer and 44 formidable 88mm flak guns. Just south of this position, and out of sight to the attackers, we find the 4th zone. If the British were able to advance this far, a Panther tank battalion of the 1st SS Leibstandarte Division, numbering around 60 tanks, along with Panzer IVs of the 22nd Panzer Regiment, lay waiting with 2 battle groups of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division and the powerful 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion equipped with 36 Tigers and a few of the brand new King Tigers. Of course, we today have a much clearer perspective of the German dispositions than the Allied planners did back in 1944. In fact, at that time, whilst it was clear that there were significant German forces built up in the area, the exact numbers and locations were hazy to say the least. For those with an interest in tank tactics and armoured combat like we would see in Operation Goodwood, why not check out today's sponsor, War Thunder? Quite simply, it's the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, with over 70 million players worldwide, and is available for free via PC, console and mobile device. With over 2,500 authentically modelled tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from the 1920s to the modern day to choose from, including the iconic Sherman and Tiger tanks used in Operation Goodwood, it's a great way to immerse yourself in epic PvP action and ideal for military history fans too. Play War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile. Use our links in the pinned comment or video description to sign up. New players and those who haven't played in the last 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack on PC or console that includes multiple premium vehicles, the extensive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions and 7 days of premium account. So, back to the action. So how exactly were the British planning to breach these formidable defences? The Allies knew that the defenders would fight fiercely for and from the villages directly in the path of the advance, and so would rely on their massive material and manpower superiority to smash through the German lines. Chief amongst those weapons was aerial bombardment. By laying a carpet of bombs along the route of the advance and assaulting behind a creeping barrage, they hoped to neutralise many German strongpoints whilst the leading armour elements burst through the German lines. Rather than get caught up in costly skirmishes, they were simply to sweep through the open terrain, bypassing these strongpoints which would be mopped up by following units. If all went to plan, 11th Armoured, led on the left by the 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry and on the right by the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, would follow this route, eventually reaching and capturing the heights of the Bourgabu Ridge, opening the road to Falaise beyond. It was though a fine balance. Bombing particularly needed to be executed in such a way that it wouldn't bring the entire advance to a standstill, with tanks struggling to move over heavily cratered ground, yet still suppress and neutralise German positions. Speed and surprise were critical. Operation Goodwood's starting point was to be here, with 2 famous bridges providing access to the flat open country that lay ahead. However, German-held positions, like the Colombelles steel factory, seen here during a bombing raid in July, which offered unobstructed views to the Allied assembly area, gave the Germans advance warning of an impending assault. So what about those men who would be spearheading that advance? Our focus for the attack to come, and therefore our perspective, will lie here, with the men of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment. Let's meet a few. First there was this man, 29-year-old Major Bill Close. Despite his young age, Bill was already a hardened campaigner. Having joined the Royal Tank Regiment way back in 1933, he'd risen from trooper through every rank until in 1942 being commissioned in the field. A veteran of France, Greece and North African campaigns, he was, by the time he returned to Europe, a highly respected leader, commanding 3 RTR's A Squadron. Within the neighbouring B Squadron, and commanding a 17-pounder armed Sherman Firefly at that time, was 24-year-old Sergeant Eric Whittaker. Having been in continuous action since D-Day, he too was a well-respected member of the regiment. Also within his tank were Jack Turner, Harry Palmer and Titch Everett. And then we meet Trooper John Jack Lyons, a 32-year-old Wolverhampton native who joined the army in mid-1940 when he was 28 years old. Originally a factory worker in hosiery production and married with a young daughter, he left everything behind to join the fight. Supporting 3 RTR in their advance were the men of G Company 8th Battalion Rifle Brigade. Barely 20 years old and commanding the 30 men of 11 platoon was this man, Lieutenant David Stileman. Only his 2nd time in action, Goodwood would be a battle he would never forget. So let's follow those men on the eve of Goodwood as they moved up towards their starting positions of the following morning. David Stileman in his platoon's Bren carriers recalled those very moments. We emerged from our peaceful orchard and started on our final trek to the concentration area. It was about 1 AM that we arrived at this sea of golden corn strewn with gliders from the D-Day landings. Along with our friends from A Squadron, we only had a 2-hour breather before making our way through the minefields. And as we looked back, we could see the ever-increasing armada of vehicles building up behind us. As 3rd Tanks move up to the start line, A Squadron was in the lead under command of Major Bill Close. He too recalled that moment. At 5:30 hours, we were in position and awaiting the bombardment which was to precede the attack. Wave after wave of bombers came over and dropped their bombs on the villages in front of us. It did seem that nothing could live under that bombardment, but how wrong we were. On the other side of the battlefield that day was this man, 20-year-old Lieutenant Richard von Rosen, acting company commander of the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion's 3rd Company outside Manneville. I was awakened by the familiar sound of aircraft engines. As I crept out from under my tank, I saw the first bomber waves approaching. From this moment on, our concentration area was subject to air bombardment. It lasted 2.5 hours without interruption. We were located in the very centre of the bombardment area. It was like hell, and I'm still astonished that I ever survived it. When I tell you that the tank weighed 58 tons and were tossed aside like playing cards, you will see just what the hell we found ourselves in. Finally, at 07:45 hours on the 18th of July, the Allied artillery opened up, behind which the 11th Armour Division, led by 3 RTR, would advance. Following within 100 yards of the creeping barrage, across this very ground, it didn't take long until they encountered their first enemy. Dazed and demoralised, German defenders came out from the cornfields in this area and attempted to surrender to the leading tanks. In the opening stanza, the advance of 3rd Royal Tanks went relatively well, making good progress against a largely stunned enemy. By 10 AM, they had already reached the small town of Grantiville, just here. As they did so, though, opposition started to intensify. Some of Major Becker's anti-tank guns, which had survived the bombardment, began firing, soon added to by the scream of rockets as nearby Nebelwerfer batteries also joined the fight. It was clear that the defenders were recovering from the initial shock. The leading tanks of 3 RTR needed to take out those unmasked Nebelwerfers in order to continue their advance. Through the dust, smoke and bomb craters, the tanks fanned out and started to engage the enemy with relentless machine gun fire, neutralising those positions one by one by sheer weight of fire or even crushing them beneath their tracks. But it wasn't all one way for the attackers. As they crossed this ground, constantly scanning for enemy ahead, the air was split by the thud of shells striking steel as the surviving self-propelled guns of Becker's No. 4 battery on the edge of Le Mesnil-Fromentel roared into life. In just a few moments, several tanks were hit, including the Sherman in which Trooper Jack Lyons was serving. Struck by an armour-piercing round just here, she immediately brewed up. Jack and several of his crewmates would not survive, their bodies being found here where they'd fallen shortly after the battle. Seeing this, commander of 3 RTR, Colonel David Silvertop, realised that a frontal assault was unlikely to succeed, therefore issued orders to proceed to the western side of the Colombelles-Solier railway embankment through this small culvert. Colonel Silvertop came on the air. "Bill, get your squadron over to the west side of the embankment." There were 2 ways to do this: either crawl over the embankment or use openings where the road of the Caen-Vimont railway went under the embankment. I chose the latter and gave instructions to my leading 2 troops. No one moved, so I stood up in my tank, waved my beret around my head and said, "Conform to me," as I shot up the embankment rather like a rat up a drainpipe. I hoped to God there were no mines. All was well and I emerged on the western side in perfectly peaceful looking countryside. The remaining 2 squadrons gave covering fire as the rest of my squadron came through and joined me. Eventually, the whole of my regimental group passed through and deployed on the western side of the embankment. With 3 RTR now safely on the other side, let's orientate ourselves. Looking to the left of our screen, we can see the railway they had just crossed, with Solier just here and the Bourgebou Ridge slightly further in the distance. To the right of here, we find Hubert, a hamlet barely 2 square kilometres in size. 3rd Royal Tanks proceeded with caution as they didn't know the severity of the opposition they were to face. All had been calm since moving over to the west of the embankment, which offered valuable protection to their left flank, but Grantiville and Solier had yet to be suppressed and thus it remained German territory, as of course did the ridge to their front. About this time, the decision was made to send out a small reconnaissance force to probe the German positions around Hubert. This unenviable task was given to young David Stileman. He recalled a memorable conversation with his commanding officer that morning. At this juncture, it just so happened that my platoon headquarters half-track vehicle was some 3 yards distant from the gallant colonel. Affixing me with those steely blue eyes, he beckoned me over and said, "Boy, we must find out if Hubert is occupied." "Jolly good idea, sir," I said, or something equally fatuous. "How do you propose to do it?" "You are going to do it," came the reply. The plan, like all good plans, was extremely simple. I was temporarily to command a section of the carrier platoon and drive hell for leather down the main street of the village. If we failed to appear, the chances are the village was occupied, but if we appeared, chances are it was not. Looking at the same ground now, but from the German perspective, we can see the edge of the village of Bras to our left. In the distance, some 12 miles away, is Caen, today much larger than it was in 1944. Slightly to the right in this area is the location of the British start line of that morning, 7 miles off. In the middle distance and moving towards us through the modern industrial estate is the gentle rise up to the Bourguibu Ridge. It was across this ground that 3 RTR would move in their assault on Hubert Folie, the village which we can now see coming into view on the right hand side of the picture. By zooming into Hubert Folie, we get a better understanding of its nature and how it was the cornerstone of the defence of the ridge. It was through these very streets that an extremely nervous young subaltern, David Stahlmann, was to venture, as he well recalled. Believe you me, once we'd started, there was no time for soldiering. Within seconds we appeared at the other side of the village and reported back that we had met no resistance and seen no sign of the enemy. But how wrong could one be? Because as we'd later discovered, the village was groaning with the enemy. By design or accident, no shot was fired at Stahlmann and his Bren carrier, but the result was the British now believed that Hubert Folie was unoccupied and so decided to proceed with their advance. Of course, the 3rd Royal Tanks were just one of the prongs of the attack. Let's leave Stahlmann and 3 RTR and move westwards to see what was happening with the 2nd 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry on the other side of the rail line. The 5 and 4 Fire's planned route was to take them between Cagny and Grantville all the way to the Bourguibu Ridge, but the first true obstacle was bypassing Cagny. It was here that they started encountering enemy forces. Now, how did the Germans react? Here's Colonel von Luck, a 33-year-old veteran of the Polish, French and Russian campaigns who had been in Paris on leave as Goodwood started, as he uncovered what was afoot. I got in my armoured car and moved slowly from Fresneville towards Le Mesnil-Fromentel, crossing Cagny very slowly. Coming to the western corner of Cagny, I was absolutely afraid about what I saw. About 50 to 60 British tanks already crossed the main road, direction southwest, and some of them already the railway and farther tanks following from the northeast. It was quite clear to me that the British had started to move through our lines and to try to break out. On his rush back to headquarters, von Luck spotted a solitary anti-aircraft battery firing into the air at Cagny. Upon ordering the battery's commander to help fight the tanks, he was met with a flat refusal and so decided on a slightly more persuasive approach. So I took my little pistol and I asked whether he would like to be killed immediately or get a high decoration. He decided for the latter. Ordered to redeploy in the northwest corner of Cagny. Around here, he was told not to engage the first tanks which were already bypassing him, but rather to target the following waves crossing his front. Switching to the drone, we can see how von Lucker positioned his forces and the range of fire available to those anti-tank guns. The trap was set. Looking from the gunner's point of view, we can get a valuable insight into how this played out on that fateful morning in these fields. When the tanks of C Squadron, 2nd, 5 and 4 Fires, advancing behind the leading waves of A and B Squadrons, arrived in this area, they found themselves in the crosshairs of the waiting battery. In seconds, 12 of the 19 tanks were burning, with dead and wounded strewn across this ground. Ahead of them, the leading elements of A and B, who had bypassed Cagny just before the battery had opened fire, were now advancing through these fields between Solière and Cagny in their attempt to gain the Bourguibu Ridge. But like their comrades in C Squadron moments earlier, they too were about to meet with a withering fire. Hit from front and flank by dug-in anti-tank guns in these villages, in just a few minutes this peaceful landscape, known as the Cauldron, was left scattered with burning Shermans and dying men. Leaving the carnage behind on the western side of the railway, let's rejoin the 3rd Royal Tanks just as the leading elements began their approach on Hubert Folie. Encouraged by Stahlmann's recce of the village, which suggested it was unoccupied, they were about to get a rude awakening. In the lead in his Sherman Firefly was Sergeant Whittaker, who recalled the following moments. As we got near the village, we suddenly started losing tanks from 88s well concealed on the ridge. To my immediate left, Sergeant Dixon was brewed up by a gun hidden in a haystack, which I eliminated. To my rear, Corporal Taffy Richardson was also hit. On getting to the ridge, I was twice hit. On bailing out, I found that my driver, Jack Turner, had been killed. The operator loader, Harry Palmer, badly wounded in the leg, and the gunner, Titch Everett, had his foot blown off. Despite incredible courage, the men of 3 RTR could go no further. The few survivors, under cover of artillery and small arms fire, had no choice but to withdraw, leaving the objective in the hands of the enemy. For that day at least, the assault on the Bourguiba Ridge was over. Whilst that initial assault had failed, the fight would go on. Throughout the day, German armour reserves held behind the ridge were thrown into the fight in an attempt to dislodge the exhausted and badly depleted defenders. But they too were about to suffer their own serious losses. Hammered by Allied air power in the shape of rocket-laden Hawker Typhoons and fresh armour reserves, they were to be brought to a bloody standstill on the slopes of the Bourguiba Ridge. By the time the sun set on the 18th of July, the bulk of the fighting was over. The Germans, despite losing over 5 miles of ground, had contained the attack, but at heavy cost. So, was Operation Goodwood in fact a victory? That's a question that's been debated for over 80 years. On one side, the great breakthrough that had been hoped for was not achieved, and relatively few German defenders had inflicted tremendous casualties on the Allies, with around 350 tanks and 6,000 casualties sustained in the course of the battle, compared to just 90 German tank losses and approximately 5,000 casualties. But, and here's the key point, of those Allied tank losses, only around 130 were total. The vast majority would, after repairs, see action again, whereas the Germans would not put a single one of those 90 tanks back into action, a loss they could ill afford. What Goodwood certainly represented was a significant blow against an ever harder pressed enemy who, under sustained pressure from both east and west, would ultimately fail in their attempts to hold the Allies, and within a month of the final shots being fired in Operation Goodwood, Normandy was free from German occupation and Paris had been liberated. So what of those men who fought across these now peaceful fields in July 1944? Some are still here. Today, not far from where he fell in battle, in the Commonwealth Wargrave Cemetery at Benneville lies Trooper Jack Lyons, who, though he never returned home, was not forgotten by his family, who chose the following epitaph to adorn his headstone. He died that we might live, his loving wife Floss and daughter Joan. For others, life would go on. Bill Close, who led A Squadron in the opening hours of the attack, would, despite being wounded 3 times and earning 2 military crosses for gallantry in the field, survive the war. Upon returning home, he fathered 4 children and went on to manage an electrical engineering company in his later life. He died in 2006, aged 91. Another man to survive the war, miraculously, was Lieutenant David Stileman. Shot between the eyes a month after Goodwood, the bullet would shatter his jaw and exit via his neck, narrowly missing his jugular vein. After a long and painful convalescence, he would return to the army and serve until 1979, retiring as a brigadier. But David Stileman never forgot the time he spent fighting here in Operation Goodwood. Many times after the war, he returned to these battlefields with young soldiers in tow to recount that fight. In one memorable return, he was accompanied by another veteran of Goodwood, Hans von Luck, who he had faced in battle several decades before. The 2 old enemies posed for this powerful photograph on that very same ground. They got on well and left as friends. Thanks for watching, and thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play it for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile using the link in our description. New and returning players who haven't played in 6 months also get a bonus pack with premium vehicles and lots more. And if you found this video interesting, why not explore our dedicated podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, where each week hosts Jesse Alexander and Professor Matthias Strohn take a detailed look at some of the most incredible episodes of the Second World War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.